Hi, I'm Caroline Fox, a print editor at Theogony.
I'm Griffin Harris, an online editor at Theogony.
I'm Margot Wagner, a print editor at Theogony.
We're here today to interview longtime CBS correspondent Bob Schieffer.
So in the past decade, outlets like BuzzFeed have come, and there's been a rise of more partisan news outlets. With the increasing prevalence of online and social media news, is the era of unbiased news essentially over?
No, I don't think so, but there is a lot of biased, opinion that's on the web and also on some of the, what I call the validation channels on cable, and that is the channels where people tune in because they're going to hear the news presented from one particular point of view. There's nothing wrong with that, but the other part is you should understand what you're listening and watching when you tune into those channels. But I think there are a lot of reliable websites and reliable cable channels. But the problem is there's just so many. When I wrote this book, This Just In, I asked the question, we have access to more information than any people who have ever lived on the earth in the history of the world. But are we more informed? Are we wiser? Or are we simply overwhelmed with so much information that we can't process it? And the short answer is we're overwhelmed. There's no way that we could possibly process all the information that we're getting today. So what we have to do, we have to be very selective and very careful about where we get our news. Know what this website or this channel's reputation is, and know, are they somebody that they don't print or broadcast something until they've checked it out? Because what's happened now is a lot of people are getting their news on social media, Facebook. And the difference in Facebook and mainline journalism is they don't check out anything, obviously. This is generally people writing for various reasons, to keep up with their family and all that kind of thing, but it's not always true, and you just have to be aware of that.
So to follow up, are more journalists and more platforms a good thing for the electorate, or do they pose a threat to the truth?
They in the long run, they will be good, but it's like the invention of the printing press. You know, we all remember the great things, the great changes that happened after the invention of the printing press. Literacy across Europe spread rapidly. We had the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. What we sometimes forget is that there was always 30 years of religious wars that came after the invention of the printing press, and so it was about 3 decades before Europe settled into any kind of equilibrium. We're at the very beginning of our communications technology revolution, and eventually it will strengthen journalism and our culture in general, but we're not there yet, and it's going to be kind of a bumpy ride for a while.
Okay, our second question is, you mentioned in Overload that Donald Trump was the most unusual candidate that you've ever covered. And we were wondering, do you think that most well-regarded publications like The Post or The Times have done a fair job of reporting on Trump's presidency as well as his campaign?
I do. I do think they have done a good job, and I think they have presented Donald Trump as he is. I have not changed my opinion when I wrote he's the most unusual candidate that I've ever covered. And I've interviewed him for years. I mean, the first time I interviewed him was way back there when the city of New York could not get the ice to freeze over in the skating rink in Central Park. And they'd spent about $11 million trying to do it. And he was a young businessman. He said, let me do it. He said, I can fix that. And in 3 months, he had people skating in Central Park. And it was a great story, you know. I mean, it was a story of, you know, bureaucratic bumbling being overcome by private enterprise. And so it was a very well-received story. Even he liked it. Well, you know, he would like that story. But having said that, I mean, I just think, you know, government, running the government on kind of spur of the moment and at the spurt of some idea is not a good way to run the government. A lot of the problems that he is having is not about policy, but because he and the people around him are so strikingly unfamiliar with process and how it works. Which button do you push to get this result? And he is the first president that was neither in the military nor in office, any kind of political office. And in many ways, that's not a disqualifier. But there are certain things to learn, and you need somebody that when you move into the White House can tell you the men's room is down this hall and the ladies' room is down this hall. And most of the people that he has brought into the government were from the fringes of American politics and really had not been in office and had very little understanding of how the government works. And we're still kind of in a shakedown cruise.
You mentioned sort of his ability, or Trump's scandals. Has the mainstream media lost its ability to set the agenda and keep public attention focused on big questions? In the past, things like Monica Lewinsky or a president refusing to release his tax returns would dominate headlines for weeks, months. Now they seem to glaze over.
Well, we've got some stormy weather right now that we're dealing with that seems to keep popping up. So I don't know where that comes down. But I think one of the problems that Donald Trump has had is he'll announce some initiative and then kind of step on his own story, as we say in journalism. Then he'll make one of these offhand remarks, and suddenly that's what's going on. Donald Trump, that was one of the ways that he got elected. Was by dominating the conversation, and the way he would do it, I don't know if he knew what he was doing had a name, but it's what a political consultant named Linton Crosby once dubbed the dead cat theory, or the dead cat strategy. And that strategy was, if you're having a dinner party, and no matter what you're talking about, if somebody throws a dead cat in the middle of the table, everybody's going to start talking about the dead cat. Well, over and over again during this campaign, Donald Trump would get on television early in the morning on Morning Joe or something like that, or he'd tweet out one of these early morning news things, and no matter where the conversation about the campaign was, he'd get on and say something outrageous, and for the rest of the day, all of the politicians, all of the candidates were suddenly talking about him. And he was able to dominate the conversation. It was an unorthodox way to win the presidency, but it worked. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure it is the wisest way to run a government.
I want to switch now from the outward results of your profession to maybe the inward workings. Yeah. Since September, some of the biggest names have been taken down by cases of sexual abuse. Yeah. Mark Halperin, Matt Lauer, Charlie Rose. Yeah. Is there something more fundamental about the culture of TV news that allows this sort of behavior? After 3, it can't just be bad apples.
Well, you're seeing it in other organizations as well. The New York Times has had a couple of events, obviously show business, and what's going on in Hollywood. These things are awful, and they have to be taken seriously, and they can't be tolerated. And I think we all have to be aware of that. I mean, I've had people say to me, some of these people I know, I had no idea that any of this was going on. I think in some cases there have been people in positions of power who thought they were just so charming that people welcome these kind of advances, and maybe they didn't realize that no, what you're doing is not welcome. I've got 3 granddaughters. I've got 2 daughters. All of them. My daughters were both interns up on Capitol Hill. I mean, I wouldn't want somebody doing things like that, and it just can't be tolerated. But I must say, among some of those that I've known about, I was just stunned. And I was talking to a couple of young women at CBS yesterday, and we were talking talking about this, and one of them said to me, he said, you know, it's interesting, and she mentioned a person, one of the people at CBS. She said, when this came out, all of the guys were surprised. All of the older people were surprised, but said everybody under 30, we weren't surprised. And so that just shows you how, you know, kind of compartmentalized we are, if nothing else, by age groups. But we have to take this seriously, and we can't be doing stories about other people unless our skirts are clean, and it's very tragic, but that's the way it is.
So you mentioned in one of your books that before a group interview, Barbara Walters complained about being seen as a pushy cookie if she asked the tough questions, which you and other male journalists are praised for. Do you think the industry's like that, and why do you think?
No, I think it's just public perception. And she's absolutely right about that. And Barbara is the single best competitor that I ever went up against. I mean, she would often travel when I was White House correspondent. She would travel with us, and I mean, you had to watch her every second of the day because, and I mean, she wasn't doing anything unfair. She's just a really good reporter, and she just never stops working. But sometimes women, because they have a generally higher pitched voice, they will often come across as shrill when men who have lower voices don't. They come across with a different tone. I mean, this is what Barbara would say. And that's why she said that. And she said, you know, I get accused of being a pushy cookie when you guys said everybody thinks you're great when you ask these hard questions. But she put her finger on it. She's absolutely right about that. And I think that women are now more accepted. I mean, you know, journalism is just like everything else in our country. You know, men dominated so many years. The women had to do twice as much work to be seen as equal. Well, I think that's changing now. And I think Barbara would not be seen that way today. But she was talking about something that was a real problem for women. But, you know, now, when I worked at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the only women who worked at the newspaper worked in the society department. I think we may have had one that worked on the city desk and covered the real news. Now most of the reporters are women. I mean, you look at CBS, all of our top reporters, most of them are women. I mean, Margaret Brennan was just named the anchor of Face the Nation. Holly Williams, just an outstanding journalist, and in the Middle East, and has snuck in and out of Syria and goes to all these places. Clarissa Ward, that used to work for us until she decided to go to work at CNN because they made her an offer she couldn't refuse. They go into the toughest and the hardest places now, and nobody even thinks about that anymore. Well, that's great when people are not thinking about this. There was a great friend of mine named Chappie James, who was a general in the Air Force, and he was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. And he said, you know, when you start talking about race, he said, or gender, he said, when you talk about the only one or the first one, he said, that's great, but you've got to get past that. And I think we're far past that now, certainly in journalism.
Speaking of women in journalism, the new movie The Post suggested that Katharine Graham's closeness to public figures like Robert McNamara or Ben Bradley's closeness to JFK blurred their ability to be objective. Have you ever felt that your relationship with a public official has conflicted with your role as a journalist?
You know, really, no. But I guess everybody feels that way. Probably it may have, you know. But let me just say something about Katharine Graham. She is one of the most remarkable people that I have ever met. And think about before the story that was told in the movie The Post, Katharine Graham had become publisher of that paper because her husband had committed suicide after having this notorious affair with another woman. So she had just come through all of that, and suddenly here she is presented with, you're the publisher of the Washington Post. The smartest thing she did was to hire Ben Bradley, who's one of the great editors of our time. And she had some very tough decisions to make in an area where she didn't know all that much about how a newspaper functioned and how it worked. But she depended and she hired people who did know how it worked, and she learned from them. And the Post, I mean, this was, you know, the New York Times, they all kind of got their nose out of joint about that movie because they said, look, we're the ones that printed the Pentagon Papers. They just caught up with us. But yes, but this was the story of Katharine Graham. It was not the story of the Pentagon Papers. But they did it, and the viability, the financial viability of this newspaper was at stake. This was not something they could just do and, okay, if it doesn't work, we'll be cool. If it hadn't worked, they would have lost the Post. That's all there was. So I have great admiration for her.
All right, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well,
we appreciate you taking.
You guys give me hope. My generation didn't do a very good job, I'm afraid, in a lot of different areas. I don't mean just in journalism, but your generation's going to have to unravel, I think, a lot of what we did and figure out what to do from there on. And the young people I meet today, I come away always impressed. And this most recent example of what young people can do, we saw down in Florida. I think that was remarkable. And I think finally it might lead to something being done in a meaningful way. I mean, those kids, they don't know anything about politics. They don't know anything about lobbyists. They don't know anything about a lot of the things that we all worry about. They just know that when 640 people die in a year and a half, that's how many have died since the Orlando club shooting, and 2,635 have been wounded. They just know that's not right, and they feel that adults have let them down. So they've taken the issue into their own hands. And I think when you see what the Florida governor did, when you see what Dick's Sporting Goods did, when they said, we're just not going to sell these weapons of war anymore, that's a direct result of what those kids did. And so I hope you guys will understand that the power that you have, even at a very early age, and you will not be afraid to use it.
Kind of you to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.